The silence in my mother's house was so complete that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I stood alone in the hallway of my childhood home on a bright Saturday morning, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. 2 weeks prior, my family had spoken in hushed tones, going quiet whenever I walked into the kitchen. My mother had looked me dead in the eye and told me to keep my weekend completely free. So I waited, staying in my old bedroom, just as she asked. But when I walked downstairs, the driveway was empty and both family cars were gone. Left behind on the kitchen counter was a single handwritten note resting under a salt shaker. It contained a short list detailing my grandmother's morning medication, instructions for taking out the trash, and a reminder to water my mother's tomato plants. There was no apology and no explanation. By noon, I was staring at my sister's social media feed. The picture showed a sunny wooden dock on Lake Arden, with my brother mid-splash and my mother holding a glass of iced tea, laughing brighter than she had in years. Across the bottom was a written caption that said it was the best family trip ever when she was not around. I did not text them, I did not cry, and I did not leave a comment. Instead, I sat in that quiet kitchen because there was one critical detail about that lake cottage that none of them knew. 2 days later, my phone would explode with dozens of missed calls and frantic text messages from my mother begging me to come back. But by then, the silence in that empty house had already given me all the clarity I needed to rewrite the rules forever. To understand why I was left behind with a list of chores, you have to know how our family functioned after my father passed away 6 years ago. I run a modest accounting firm on Main Street in Crestwood, Ohio, managing small business payrolls and tax filings. My life is organized, exact, and quiet. When my father died suddenly of a heart attack, the structural beam of our family collapsed, and I instinctively crawled underneath to hold everything up. I became the designated problem solver for everyone. My grandmother Ruth's daily heart medicine schedules lived in my phone reminders. My mother Carol's utility bills were paid through my online bank account. Every single family tax return crossed my office desk every April without me ever asking for a fee. On a high shelf in my office sat a thick green binder tracking 6 years of personal funds I had quietly poured into maintaining their lives. My family was skilled at looking perfect from the outside. My mother treated every holiday like a staged play, deciding who sat where, and whose life updates were worthy of being shared. My older sister Brooke worked part-time at a regional bank, married to Josh, a local warehouse supervisor. Their 12-year-old daughter Ava was the only person in that house who ever bothered to ask me how my week went. Then there was my younger brother Dean, who sold fitness equipment and spent years looking for investors for a gym franchise that never materialized. Every Sunday, we gathered for dinner at my mother's house, and without fail, a logistical issue would surface. Someone would mention a broken appliance, a late tax notice, or an insurance claim. The response from the table was always identical, spoken with effortless expectation. Faith will handle it. Nobody ever asked if I had the time or the desire to handle it. Was treated like an utility that was expected to run without complaint. I filed their tax returns, resolved their dispute notices, and handled their paperwork. The dynamic only shifted late last autumn, when I finally drew my very first boundary. My brother Dean asked me to co-sign a high-interest loan for a brand new pickup truck he could not afford, and I declined, offering instead to help him build a realistic monthly budget for a used vehicle. He looked at me with deep offense, and the cold shoulder at Sunday dinners lasted for nearly a month. My mother expressed her disapproval without ever raising her voice, simply passing the dinner dishes to me last. I assumed that cold spell had cleared up by the summer, but I completely misjudged what that resentment had slowly turned into. The quiet preparations began 2 weeks before the holiday weekend, starting with a phone call from my mother while I was balancing client spreadsheets. She told me with an unmistakable smile in her voice that I needed to keep my Labor Day weekend entirely open. When I asked what was going on, she simply told me to wait and trust her. At the following Sunday dinner, the entire house was heavy with an unspoken secret. My sister and mother stopped talking the moment I walked into the kitchen with a salad bowl, and Dean kept staring at his phone with a subtle smirk. At one point, little Ava skipped up to me and asked if I knew where we were all going. But Brooke immediately grabbed her shoulder and guided her toward the dessert counter before she could finish her sentence. I convinced myself that they were planning a surprise for me. It sounds foolish now, but after 6 years of managing everyone else's obligations, I wanted to believe my family was finally doing something thoughtful for my 34th birthday. I asked directly on 2 separate occasions just to be certain. I asked my mother if they were planning a trip to the family cottage, explaining that I needed to reschedule 2 major client deadlines if we were going away. She looked me in the eyes and told me to stay in town because I would definitely want to be there. A week later, I asked Brooke if I should order groceries or pack coolers, and she assured me that everything was completely taken care of. Because I trusted them, I rescheduled an important quarterly review with my primary corporate client and surrendered my non-refundable registration for a regional professional seminar in Columbus. I routinely checked our family messaging group for trip details, but it remained entirely quiet. Back in January, I had tried to address our mounting family expenses by presenting a straightforward, transparent cost-sharing plan at my mother's dining table. My mother reacted with tears as if I had personally insulted her, and my sister accused me of treating our family like a business invoice. Dean mockingly referred to me as a cash register with a ponytail. I quietly folded the proposal back into my bag and continued paying for their home repairs and property assessments out of my own pocket. They called me a cash register in January, but by September, I learned what my presence actually meant to them. On the Friday evening before the holiday, my mother invited me over for dinner and insisted that I sleep in my old bedroom. She prepared a full roast on a Friday night, an unusual effort that should have alerted my instincts immediately. The atmosphere in the house felt carefully staged, with Dean constantly monitoring his phone and Brooke dropping by to whispered conversations.
That abruptly stopped whenever I entered the room.
Walking past the laundry room, I caught a brief glimpse of a packed navy suitcase standing near the door, and my chest warmed with the foolish assumption that a surprise trip was truly waiting for me. I decided right then not to ask questions or ruin their surprise. When Brooke's family left for the night, Ava wrapped her arms around my waist longer than usual, whispering a quiet goodbye that I mistook for fatigue. My mother kissed my cheek at the top of the stairs, repeating her gentle instruction not to make any plans for the weekend. I fell asleep in my childhood bed, listening to the faint murmur of their voices through the drywall, feeling completely secure. Waking up at 7:40 the next morning, the house was entirely silent, devoid of cooking sounds, footsteps, or the morning news. I lay in bed for a full minute, half expecting them to jump out with balloons, before walking downstairs to find an empty driveway and 2 missing vehicles. Resting on the kitchen counter was that casual note detailing my grandmother's medications and a list of household chores. There was no note of gratitude, no destination listed, and not even my actual name, just a generic pet name written at the bottom. Standing in my pajamas with that piece of paper in my hand, the reality of the situation hit me with absolute clarity. They had not told me to keep my weekend open because a surprise was waiting for me. I was the plan itself. I was left behind to act as the unpaid house sitter, the nurse for my grandmother, and the caretaker for the garden, while the rest of the family went on vacation. I tried calling my mother once, but it went straight to her automated voicemail. So I carefully set the phone down and brewed a single cup of coffee. Standing alone in that spotless kitchen, I drank it slowly while my family drove north on the highway.
By noon, the reality of their destination was confirmed through my sister's public social media story,
Which showcased the pristine blue waters of Lake Arden and my father's old waterfront cabin. The final image featured my brother, my sister, my mother, and the kids enjoying the sun, captioned with a blunt statement celebrating how wonderful the trip was without my presence. Over 200 people had already viewed the post, including our extended relatives who had left supportive comments. I read that caption 4 consecutive times, waiting for an overwhelming wave of anger to take over, but instead, An icy composure settled over me. I did not type a heated response, I did not leave a comment, and I did not send a single text message to anyone. I set my phone face down, washed my coffee mug, placed it neatly in the drying rack, and walked out to the porch. I grabbed the watering can to tend to my mother's plants, but stopped halfway, setting the full container down on the wooden railing, untouched. They had left me alone in a house where I had full administrative access to every shared financial account, household record, and digital device I had been tasked with managing over the last 6 years. I locked my mother's front door, drove directly to my apartment to change into real clothes, and then headed straight to my grandmother's small brick house on Cedar Street. Ruth was an 83-year-old woman with mobility challenges and an exceptionally sharp mind, whom they had also chosen to leave behind because accommodating her was deemed too inconvenient. When she opened her front door and looked at my face, she did not ask a single question, simply inviting me inside to cook breakfast together. We sat at her small kitchen table, eating scrambled eggs off her vintage plates, deliberately avoiding any mention of the lake cottage for an entire hour. Living with the only family member who had never treated me like an administrative service brought a rare sense of peace. Ruth had spent over 3 decades teaching elementary school, giving her an extraordinary ability to read people and detect when something was wrong. She poured a second cup of coffee and calmly explained that my mother had visited her on Thursday, offering a weak excuse about steep cabin stairs to justify leaving her out of the trip. Ruth pointed out the obvious irony, noting that while nobody ever invites the caretaker on the outing, everyone expects the lights to stay on. She looked at me with complete steady focus, revealing that my late father had made a very specific legal arrangement regarding the cottage before his passing. When I pressed her for details, she gently advised me that anger needed to clear out before I could properly execute whatever steps were required next. She then dropped another crucial piece of information, mentioning that my mother had stopped by earlier that week carrying a thick folder of property documents, adding that people do not bring heavy legal paperwork along for a simple weekend at the lake. That evening, I picked up my grandmother's tablet computer to clear out her lingering notifications before a scheduled telehealth appointment. Because I maintained all of her electronic devices using an old secondary account my sister had logged into years ago, a calendar alert flashed across the home screen. It was an appointment entry for Monday morning at 11, titled with the name of Gary Sutton, the most prominent commercial realtor in our county. My mind immediately began connecting the pieces, calculating why a high-profile real estate agent was scheduled to meet my family at the cabin on a holiday weekend. They had scheduled a major property walkthrough with a listing agent while conveniently ensuring that the one person who audited every family contract was kept 2 hours away. I opened the messaging application synced to that device. My hands cold as I scrolled through a private group chat named Cottage Crew that had been active since late May. Month after month, my mother, sister, and brother had meticulously planned this trip, actively coordinating dates to ensure it fell precisely when I was tied down with client work. The most damaging message came from my mother in early June, responding to little Ava asking why I was not invited to the lake. My mother had typed a direct reply stating that I could not come because I would insist on doing the math out loud in front of everyone. Reading those exact words written by my own mother transformed my deep emotional hurt into pure, cold focus. I continued scrolling through the attached documents in that private chat until I found a modified version of a family budget spreadsheet I had originally built for my mother. They were using my customized formulas to calculate the expenses of hosting the realtor for lunch and splitting the travel costs among themselves. The messages outlined their entire strategy. Hold a private family meeting on Sunday night to align their demands, meet Gary Sutton on Monday morning, and put the lake property on the market before the autumn season. There was a deeper financial motive hidden inside their plan that explained their sudden urgency. Dean was facing severe credit defaults from failed business ventures. Brooke was trying to secure tuition funds for private schooling, and my mother wanted to liquidate the asset to clear her personal credit lines. They were planning to sell my father's beloved lake house and divide the cash proceeds 3 ways, entirely excluding me from the distribution under the assumption that I did not need the money. They believed that because I was quiet, organized, and routinely managed their obligations without complaining, I would simply accept the outcome after the listing agreement was already signed. What they completely overlooked was the actual legal ownership structure of that property, a detail my father had put in place long before his death. Sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table late that night, I retrieved my laptop and opened the secure digital files backed up from my office green binder. When my father purchased that lake cottage 20 years ago, he paid off the primary mortgage using a combination of personal savings and a direct private loan provided by my grandmother Ruth. To protect the property from being recklessly liquidated in the future, my father had structured the deed with a specific joint tenancy clause and a recorded secondary lien in Ruth's name. Furthermore, when my father passed away without a formal updated will, his half of the property title defaulted directly into an estate trust where I was named as the sole managing executor and co-owner. My family had operated for 6 years under the foolish assumption that my mother held sole ownership of the cottage simply because her name appeared on the county tax assessments that I personally paid for her every year. They had never bothered to read the actual land registry documents or title deeds resting on the top shelf of my office. On Sunday afternoon, while my family was preparing for their evening strategy dinner at the lake, I quietly drove 2 hours north to Lake Ardennes. I did not pull into the main driveway or make a dramatic entrance. Instead, I parked my car down the road near the marina and walked down the wooded path leading to the water. I stood near the tree line for a few minutes, watching them through the large back windows of the cabin as they sat around the dining table with printouts of the listing agreement spread across the wood. They were drinking wine, laughing, and gesturing at the pages, completely confident that their plan was falling perfectly into place. I walked up the back porch stairs, pushed the unlocked sliding glass door open, and stepped into the dining room without saying a word. The entire room froze instantly, the laughter cutting off mid-sentence as my mother dropped her pen onto the table. Brooke's face drained of color, while Dean immediately straightened up in his chair, his expression shifting from surprise to immediate irritation. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly as she asked what I was doing there and why I had not stayed home to look after the house and my grandmother. I walked directly to the head of the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down calmly, placing my professional leather briefcase flat on the table between their wine glasses and the realtor's draft contract. I looked at each of them individually before speaking, keeping my voice entirely level and quiet. I informed them that I had come to review the math out loud, using the exact phrase my mother had typed into their private group chat 3 months earlier. Dean slammed his hand on the table, demanding to know why I was interfering with a family decision that had already been agreed upon by everyone else in the room. Brooke stepped forward, attempting to turn the situation around by accusing me of being selfish, claiming that the family needed this money to survive while I was comfortably managing my own business. I opened my briefcase, pulled out 3 identical bound copies of the property title, the estate trust agreement, and the active land lien documents, sliding 1 copy to my mother, 1 to Brooke, and 1 to Dean. I clearly explained to them that my mother held only a 40% fractional interest in the property, while my father's estate trust held the remaining 60%, over which I maintained sole legal authority as executor. Furthermore, I pointed out the recorded legal lien held by grandmother Ruth, which required full satisfaction of an outstanding $60,000 debt before any transfer of title could ever be executed. The room fell into complete, suffocating silence as my mother picked up the documents with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the official county stamps and legal signatures she had ignored for 6 years. Dean's aggressive demeanor dissolved into panic as he realized that the listing agreement sitting on the table was completely invalid without my explicit written consent as executor. Brooke began to cry, attempting to appeal to my sense of family obligation by asking how I could do this to my own mother after everything she had been through. I looked at my sister and reminded her of the caption she had posted online just 24 hours earlier, stating clearly that they had made their choice regarding my place in this family long before I walked through the door. I told them that the meeting with Gary Sutton at 11 o'clock the following morning was still going to happen, but the agenda would be entirely different from what they had planned. I informed them that I would be meeting the realtor personally to list the property for sale under my direct authority as estate executor. However, the net proceeds would not be distributed as a casual cash payout for them to split among themselves. Every dollar from the sale would be directed into a restricted legal trust designated exclusively for my grandmother Ruth's long-term healthcare, housing, and living expenses for the remainder of her life. Any remaining balance after satisfying her lien and securing her future would be held in the estate account to reimburse the 6 years of personal funds I had spent maintaining their properties and paying their bills. Dean stood up and yelled that I was destroying his financial future, but I simply closed my briefcase, locked the clasps, and looked him in the eye without flinching. I told him that his financial obligations were no longer my responsibility to manage, resolve, or co-sign, and that my time as their unpaid administrator was officially over. The next morning at 11 o'clock, Gary Sutton arrived at the cottage expecting a routine listing signature from a cooperative family, only to find me sitting alone on the front porch with the complete legal file prepared. I explained the ownership structure clearly, presented my legal authority as executor, and laid out the terms of the sale, which he accepted without hesitation. When my family realized that I was executing the entire process strictly by the book without yielding to guilt, emotional outbursts, or historical patterns, they packed their bags and left the cottage in total silence. They drove back to Crestwood, knowing that the era of relying on my quiet labor while excluding me from their lives had come to a permanent end. Over the next 3 months, the lake cottage was officially sold to a young family who appreciated the property just as my father had years ago. The full proceeds were deposited directly into the court-supervised trust account I established for my grandmother, securing her comfort and financial independence in her own home for the rest of her life. My brother was forced to handle his own debt obligations through conventional financial counseling, while my sister and mother had to learn how to manage their household budgets without leaning on my firm's free services. Our Sunday dinners ceased entirely, replaced by a quiet, professional distance that allowed me to finally reclaim my own time, energy, and peace of mind. I still work in my tidy office on Main Street in Crestwood, managing client portfolios and writing in pencil, because ink is reserved for things that are truly final. The heavy green binder on my shelf is now closed and archived, serving as a quiet reminder of the years I spent carrying weight that was never mine to bear. I learned that being the calm, reliable person in a family does not mean you are required to let people treat your devotion as convenience. Sometimes the most powerful thing a quiet person can do is stop holding up the weight, step back into the light, and let the math speak for itself.